Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Lara Mossman online. Let me introduce Lara. Lara is currently studying a PhD in positive psychology and sport at La Trobe University in Melbourne. And she's got a big goal. Her goal is to create resources that draw on the science of wellbeing, particularly for parents and adolescents. She is the co-founder of the Strengths Exchange with Professor Lee Waters, and that's a strengths-based positive parent website. And she does a whole pile of work through the Centre for Positive Psychology at the University of Melbourne. And a lot of that work is working with sports coaches, helping them have more of a grasp of positive psychology and its relationship with sport. And she's done some online training programs for sports psychologists and sports coaches around positive psychology. And this training is called Growth Focused Sports Coaching, and it incorporates self-determination theory, mindfulness, achievement goals, growth mindset, character strengths, and goal setting. And coaches use what they learn in the modules on the training course to design something Lara calls their coaching legacy, which in essence is about them defining their role as a coach beyond traditional metrics such as trophies won and players developed for the senior teams. So this stuff I'm absolutely fascinated by. It draws on the kind of things I do every single day. Lara, did I get the core essence of what you do? Did I get that biography right?
Yes, the research component where I built the website is through La Trobe University. And my work with the coaches is through La Trobe, but I teach all of this to students at the University of Melbourne as well as students at La Trobe University.
So life consists of research and teaching and consulting, sort of an awesome combination of the three.
Yes, it's the most exciting area I think I could possibly have got involved in. I absolutely love it. And I just wanted to say as well at the start, thank you so much for inviting me on to talk to you.
No worries. No, I'm honoured that you've given up some time to chat with me. So look, let's begin at the beginning, and we've had a basic rundown there, but what are you doing at the moment? Obviously, you're relating positive psychology with sports. I know you're a passionate football fan, soccer fan, and everybody knows I work heavily in football, that being soccer, and I'm conscious that we don't want to let our passions run away with us and make sure we're not too football centric on this show. But so what are you doing? How are you relating positive psychology to sport? How are you helping coaches every single day learn more about this subject matter? What are they learning from you?
Well, if I can take it back just one step and say that through my work at the Centre for Positive Psychology at Melbourne, I saw a lot of my colleagues working in positive education. So that was looking at things like teacher wellbeing and also how teachers can facilitate classrooms that are better for student wellbeing, motivation and that sort of thing. And every weekend, I've got 3 children, and every weekend I'd be on the sidelines of games, so whether that was football or basketball, and I'd be watching and think, we could do with some help in this space in terms of bringing some of the ideas from positive psychology into how sports environments are facilitated for player development. And I got involved in writing for the Player Development Project, and so really started to think about how can this science be applied. One of the challenges I've faced is it's a really new area. So I had to kind of go to the drawing board and say, well, what do I think I can make the biggest impact in? And so what I ended up doing was thinking that working with coaches would probably be the most effective way. So I started to look at the science and the research around how can coaches facilitate sports environments or create sports environments that promote player wellbeing and promote player motivation to lead to a higher quality sort of form of motivation in players. And I found there's a fair bit of research out there. So I was able to draw on that to design my own program and then bring into that ideas from positive psychology, such as character strengths and ideas about designing your best possible coaching self or your coaching legacy.
Okay, and so you mentioned this term positive sports environment, and you've also mentioned the term character strengths. How do those two work together? Because I get the notion of positive sports environment. We want our young players to flourish within a culture of, whether you call it positivity or positive behaviours. Character strengths. What is a character strength within coaching, and why should coaches care about character strengths?
That's a really good question, because often coaches might say something like, my role is really to teach them the tactical aspects of the game. However, from the research, it's very clear that coaches can have an amazing impact on players. They can do things like leave a lasting legacy for that player, so that they learn things like, how to be a good sportsman, for example. And that's where I see the character strengths coming in. So one example of a character strength might be, for example, self-control. So if you think about a situation in a game where you have a coach doesn't like a decision that the referee makes, or a tackle that one of the opposition player does, and they just lose it. They start shouting at them. I mean, I've been on the sidelines and seen coaches red carded for certain behaviours on more than one occasion, and in multiple sports. And so that would be an example where the coach wasn't using their strength of self-control. And so one of the things I sort of talk to coaches is how they might identify their character strengths. And if they were going to use self-regulation, it would be a case of role modelling self-regulation to their players, and talking to them about the importance of, being able to recognise when you're feeling frustrated, and manage that behaviour.
A lot of rich stuff there that you said in the last 30 seconds. So you said at the beginning coaches might define their role as the tactical coach. And listeners of this podcast and people who read my material would know how passionate I am about coaches being a psychosocial coach, defining themselves more as psychosocial coaches rather than tactical coaches. And paradoxically, you actually become a better coach of the technical and the tactical side by putting psychosocial first. So that certainly resonates with me, and I think when you're a psychosocial coach, you're inclined to become more self-aware and put self-awareness at the forefront of your coaching, not just for your players but for yourself. And when you do that, you're standing on the sidelines and you're more in tune with your inner world, aren't you? It's just you're able to be a bit more flexible. You're able to perhaps place some attention out into the external world and watch your players and watch what they're doing and guide where appropriate. But you're also able to guide your inner world. You're also able to check in and go, how am I feeling here? What am I thinking? And how is that impacting my behaviours? So I think what I hear you say is knowing your strengths enables you to become more self-aware, and so you become a better regulator of yourself in the moment. Would that be a fair sort of summary?
That's absolutely one aspect of it, and I couldn't agree with you more about the importance of that, that role that you're saying the coaches need to play. Because, for example, the research is very clear that from about the age of 13, players, there's like a drop off the cliff, if you like. There's a dramatic drop in the number of players that are participating in sport. So, we know that the coaches can create environments that players want to come back to, but we also know that sometimes coaches can create environments that just turn players off because they're not tuned into what's going on. And we also know from research here in Australia that if we look at wellbeing in terms of flourishing across 5 different measures, which are positive emotions, engagement, which is flow or being in the zone, positive relationships, meaning and accomplishment. If we look at adolescents on those measures, we also know that players who participate in team sport are generally higher across all of those measures than the average population of adolescents. So it's so important for wellbeing to be involved in sport, and we know coaches play a big role in keeping them in there.
What were those 5 measures, Lara? So we've got positive emotions, flow, meaning, relationships. What was the other one?
Accomplishment.
Accomplishment.
So So that's based on Martin Seligman's PERMA. The measure is slightly different for adolescents. So they changed some things. So for the adolescent measure, it's the engagement piece is in there, perseverance is in there, optimism, connectedness, and happiness. Right. They're how they translate that into a teenage space, if you like.
You mentioned a name there, Martin Seligman, and I want to, because I'm conscious we've got an audience listening in. I'm sure you'd agree with me, Lara. I mean, he is the founding father of positive psychology. I think I'd be right in saying that, and really worth Googling Martin Seligman and looking at his work, would you say, for coaches?
Yes, absolutely. Martin Seligman actually designed the Master of Applied Positive Psychology that I did. He designed it over in the University of Pennsylvania. Yep. And I was in the first cohort of students to graduate here at the University of Melbourne with that Master's. So my background and training very much stems from, I guess you'd say, his idea, along with people like Csikszentmihalyi, who's the flow guy. Yep. And Chris Peterson, or the late Chris Peterson, who helped, develop the character strengths idea. And their work really founded the area of positive psychology, which is looking at, what happens if we look at what's best in people rather than always focusing on fixing problems.
Positive emotions, flow, meaning, relationships, accomplishment. And I'm kind of just speaking to the audience here. How many of you put those concepts, words to the forefront of your mind when you think of your coaching? How many of you really think I think we're so socialized in coaching into the X's and the O's rather than things like flow and positive emotion and meaning and relationships. Accomplishment might be something that coaches naturally think of, but perhaps accomplishment around outcome measures such as winning, such as developing players for a senior side or the first team or whatever it might be. And I'm sure there's other more appropriate indices of accomplishment. I'm going to come back. I just want to park those because they're so important, and we'll have a great conversation around those. But I just want to come back to the character strengths because, we talked about the importance of self-awareness, self-regulation, and having character strengths around that. But I just want to read a little excerpt from your piece in the player development project about character strengths. So you've said here, we'll start with honesty as an example. So you're using honesty so we'll start with honesty as an example. A coach particularly high in honesty might value giving constructive feedback to her players, although she might also need to draw on kindness to temper her feedback so as not to be hurtful. And you give another example, but I think that's really interesting because what that says to me is that as a coach, when I'm passionate, when I'm engaged and interested in knowing about myself, knowing about my character strengths, I've also got to understand that the strengths I bring to the table, they may have to. I'm not going to say your strengths can be your weaknesses, but your strengths are things that you also have to manage as well. If I'm a particularly honest person, that can be a strength, but I also need to know how to deliver honesty, how to temper that honesty. Would that be a fair thing to say, Lara?
You are so spot on. The original and early research into character strengths kind of said, identify your top 5 strengths and, go forth and use them. And of course, people that are, intellectual thinkers would start going, well, hang on a minute. What if your best friend says, does my bum look big in this dress? And, then you have to go, honesty says, yes, actually it does. Or do you use kindness and say, oh, you look beautiful, go out and have a good time? Which is something they can't change. And so I think the more modern research, and certainly where the strengths in sport is being used, is much more in a developable idea. So, developing your strengths and understanding what context is appropriate to draw on which one. And the example that you just read out, I would even sort of say, as a coach, if you start to have really good interpersonal relationships with your players, then which players can take a bit more honesty, and which players might need to be, a little bit more kindness. And it's working out when to use them, in general at the team level, but also at the individual level, what's appropriate in that regard.
Know your players is a well-worn cliche, but in sport, but it's a cliche because it's so true,
yes.
But with that, know yourself, and in terms of knowing yourself, and in terms of knowing your character strengths, is there a piece of advice that you'd give to coaches in terms of understanding your character strengths a bit more, or becoming a little bit more self-aware?
Sure. So a couple of things around that. So the first one is if a coach wants to discover their character strengths, what they can do is they can jump onto the VIA Institute website, and they can take their strengths for free on that website, and it will give them a list of all 24 strengths in order, from their top strengths down to their lesser strengths. We don't say it's not a strength, but a lesser strength.
Yep.
And so they can actually use a tool. It's free. You just have to register with that website to be able to access, the survey, basically.
And sorry, Lara, sorry to interject. When you say VIA, I assume is that VIA? So they just have to Google VIA character strengths.
That's correct. Yeah. So www.viacharacter.org/survey and then /account/register. And so once you register with that website, then you can take the test, if you like. Make yourself a cup of tea and give yourself 20 to 30 minutes to complete it, and you can print off your report at the end. And in addition to that, my website is currently not live public. It's sort of being used in research at the moment, but I have developed definitions of the strengths based around sports coaching, which people can go on and have a look and sort of interpret their strengths in a more coaching context.
Yeah, and I would really encourage coaches to do that. Just taking some time to learn about yourself, to learn about your strengths is important. Is there something specific they can do? Once you're aware of your character strengths, where can you go from there? How can you improve your ability to coach based on knowing your strengths?
So I think one of the first things is to start to think about them. Like, am I using these in my coaching? So maybe just jot down, it doesn't have to be anything formal like a journal, but just jot down when you realise that strength comes in handy or useful. So it might be things like forgiveness when somebody doesn't do what you want them to do, for example, in terms of training or in terms of the game. One of the things I see regularly in sport would be gratitude. So, coaches getting players to shake each other's hand after the game and to come up and shake the coaches and thank them. In all of the teams my kids are involved in when they're playing football, they're always shaking hands after training and everything else. So there'd be examples. I've interviewed coaches that have demonstrated wonderful humour in their coaching, even at professional senior level. And that's, so people can bring sort of different strengths. Creativity is a popular one people like to see with players. But even curiosity, so things like, if I explore new developments in my coaching and the game, what might that bring or what might that add to my coaching? So there's all sorts of different ways people can use it. The other thing I'd say is once you start to get a little bit familiar and you've what I would describe as played in this space and sort of saw when your strengths are coming out and how they're helpful, how they're role modelling good sportsmanship to your players, because most of them would be role modelling good sportsmanship, you can start to think about your best possible coaching self. And that's like you at your best when you're coaching. So when things are going right, when you've got that, for example, self-control happening, those sorts of things, when are you at your best and what's kind of going on at that time?
I think, every point you've made there is fantastic. I love that idea of best possible coaching self, and just every coach articulating to themselves, whether it's written in written form or just in their own mind, articulating to themselves at their very best. What does that look like? What does that feel like? What do others experience? What strengths are involved in that? I think that's so important. I mean, that's something I talk with players about all the time in terms of their game. What does your best game look like? What does it feel like?
Yeah.
And I think coaches could be doing something similar for their coaching. What I also hear you say, which I think is so powerful, is providing space in your activities or within your coaching culture for players to experience character strengths, if you like. You know, one of the terms that you used was appreciation, so players shaking hands, just finding pockets of moments where players can experience the opportunity to explore their strengths, other people's strengths, what could be construed as strengths within a sports context. I think is a really useful thing. And again, I think what's so important is for coaches to take a step back and say, how can I incorporate this into my culture? How can I incorporate these ideas into my activities?
Can I give you one example as well from a strength that I've seen from interviewing a lot of coaches who work at the national level or with professional athletes or even sort of like state level coaches here in Australia?
Yeah, go for it, please.
So judgment's one that comes up in the character strengths, and often people sort of go, judgment? That makes me sound judgmental, and it doesn't mean that at all. And where I've just seen this beautifully played out, and it seems to be quite common in some of the coaches that I've worked with in my research, would be an example of when a player makes a mistake on the pitch. So instead of just sort of saying you should have done X or Y, you know, at that moment, they'll all say to the player, what did you see there? Why did you make that decision? And sometimes they say the player just made a mistake, but other times they'll say, you know, I didn't see what they saw. So they're very good at getting all perspectives before they make a judgment on how to respond to that. So those coaches are then able to decide whether do I then impart my expertise and my advice with the player, or do I work with the player to help them execute that more successfully, what they were trying to do, you know, in the future.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and we're sort of digging deeper into the nuts and bolts of coaching there. I mean, when an activity is going on and a player makes what could be construed as a mistake, for a coach, as you've suggested, to just simply dive in and say, you did this, I want you to do that. Well, it's very, very challenging to correct somebody when you can't see the world through their eyes. So in that moment, and this is one of the toughest things about coaching, because having the time to ask a question, having the time to ask a question to actually climb inside the world of the player and ask what they were seeing and why they made that decision, is sometimes you just don't have the time to do that as a coach. And coaching on the run, as I always say, is one of the toughest things to do. But sometimes you've got to do that, because if you don't actually elicit that information from the player, you actually might be doing more harm than good. You might be imparting information that actually either isn't relevant or would make that player worse for that information. So it strikes me that judgment is an important character strength in that respect.
Yeah, it is, and I think you know, you coming to your point, when I talk to coaches about the two types of behaviour that in the training I've built are particularly or styles of coaching, if you like, that I particularly discuss. One of them is autonomy supportive behaviour, and the other is controlling coaching. I can define that a little bit for you later if you want. I talk about it in terms of buckets and sort of say, you know, you might have some behaviours in one bucket and some behaviours in the other. The idea is to have more of them in your autonomy supportive bucket. And in that regard, it's a similar thing you're talking about there with players. You're not going to jump in on every single mistake that happens in a training session or in a game. It's like you said, it's not realistic. But where the really important things are going on, or where you identify that it would be really helpful to understand something, that's when you can have that conversation. So again, it's not saying to coaches you have to behave like this all the time. It's just like, what would happen in your coaching or your sporting environment if you introduce more of this sort of thing?
Now, I love what you said there, because you've introduced this notion of autonomy supportive coaching and you use the term controlling coaching. Can you define autonomy supportive coaching for me and controlling coaching? We can go from there.
Okay. So autonomy support was a challenge for me because I'd like to at this point give a nod to some really important research that's going on over in the UK through the University of Birmingham, which is Joan Duda's work, where she's done involved in the PAPA project, which is looking at autonomy support and controlling coaching kind of behaviours in often in community type clubs, sport, particularly football. Also, there's research being done out here at the University of Wollongong, which is in New South Wales, which is around a website called aheadofthegame.org, and that's Dr. Stuart Vella's work, and that's looking at wellbeing with athletes and using these types of terms. So before I go on, I just didn't want to say I invented this idea. I've just developed it and incorporated more positive psychology ideas into it.
Lara, we all stand on the shoulder of giants. You can be assured.
I know.
We don't. Yes, we're all sort of working off the back of other people's work. I certainly do. That's for sure.
That's fine. I just wanted to be clear that it's going to sound like I'd just come up with this amazing idea all by myself. So what I did, Joan Duda describes autonomy-supported coaching as empowering coaching and controlling coaching as disempowering coaching, which is really wonderful language. But because I was doing something slightly different with what I was doing, I thought, well, can I work with the language that is in the science literature? Autonomy support is one of those terms. And I worked going into clubs here in Australia and training sports coaches in essentially what became an online online training program that I built around all of this. And what I decided to do was introduce them to the idea in terms of cars. And I discussed with them the idea of a manual car. And I said, if you think about a manual car, the driver sitting in the driving seat is in control of everything. They're in control of the gear the car's in. They're in control of where you're, steering the car. They're in control of every aspect of that vehicle. And then we look at the progression of cars and we get to sort of now where we have autonomous driving cars. So things like the Tesla cars with, the driver sits there and may guide to some extent, but they're not controlling the car the whole time. They're letting the car do the driving some of the time. And so I used that analogy with the coaches that I worked with, and I found they picked up the terms straight away. So instantly they were able to see that, in that instance, if the car was the player, the controlling version is to be doing everything for the player. And an example of that would be a coach that when a player on the field, let's just say you're in a match context, a player's on the field and they're out of position and the coach shouts at them where they want them to be. And with the autonomous car example that I gave, I have the player, you might be in the driving seat as a coach. You're not relinquishing the driving seat, but you're handing over a lot more decision making to the car or, the player in this context. So an autonomy supportive coach in that way might use questions to the player. I've actually listened to an interview that you were on previously, a different podcast, and you were talking about giving very specific tasks or instructions to players. And I really advocate for that too. So an autonomous coach might sort of just, remind player what that task is or work with the player on what it was they wanted them to do, but just have that clear instruction there. So it's not like they're giving up control, but they, if they do want a player to do something very specific, they would give a rationale behind that, reason for it more.
To a degree, you're co-creating solutions. It's a co-creation. It's setting out an activity. You're providing, you're communicating limits and the rules, if you like, the restrictions, the rules. You're enabling a player, you're empowering a player or players to explore. But within that, you might instruct, you might remind players of a task that they've personally got to achieve or complete. So there's a sense of a co-creation alongside empowering autonomy. Yes,
and it isn't, like I said, it isn't about handing over. It's very different from the example I would use is permissive parenting. They're the parents that would sit down and just go, yes, go off and do whatever you want. If you want to climb that fence over to the main road, that's fine. That's very permissive. Autonomy support isn't about saying you can do whatever you want, and we actually know the outcomes around that in parenting are pretty, you wouldn't want them for your child. But in terms of coaching, it is still, like you've said, co-creating. It is still being in control of you're still in the position that your expertise is valued, it's required. But when appropriate, giving players choice. And when it's not appropriate to give them a choice, then to provide a rationale for why you want them to do something. So another aspect of autonomy supported behaviour, I talk about behaviours to dial up, because again, it's not about you have to be this, it's just can you dial these up in your coaching at all. And one idea might be, so you've got this idea of giving a rationale and also acknowledging players' feelings and perspectives. So a classic example would be when you ask a player to play in a position that they don't normally play in, that they don't want to play in. So let's just say they're normally a midfielder. They need to work on their 1v1 defence, so you want them to have a bit of time in defence. A very controlling coach, when the player says, but why have I got to go back in defence, might say something like, because I told you to, get back there. Whereas a more autonomy supportive coach might say, I need you to go into the defence because I really need you to work on remember we had that target or that goal for you to work on your 1v1 defence. And you're going to get more opportunity to do that if you play in the back line today. But then you might use that acknowledging a player's feelings and perspectives by saying something like, I remember when my coach asked me to play in a position I didn't want to, and I didn't like it very much, but I really noticed how it improved my game. So you're giving a rationale, you're giving a reason why that might be important.
It paints a really good picture, and you're kind of enveloping your explanation in a positive frame. Essentially, is that going back, and if you're a midfielder and you're going back and playing as a fullback, and the player says, "Well, why do I want to do this?" It's helping them to look at the world through a lens that says, "I'm going to get this out of it. I'm going to get this out of it. These are the things I'm going to get out of doing these. This is the advantage of doing this. Is the positive aspect." I think also from an autonomy perspective, it could be asking the player the question. What do you think you'll get out of going back as a fullback? What do you know about playing as a fullback? And so if there's the time, and again, this comes back to a lot of coaches will be listening in and saying, yeah, Dan, that's very nice, and I get that, but I don't have the time to ask the questions because I've got 20 players, I'm on my own, I've got an hour at tops, and if you're in England, it's raining and it's horrible and we just want to get on with the activity. So what I like about what you've said is autonomy can actually be communicating the answer. It can be reinforcing an answer, a reason why. If there is time, then it might be asking the player in question a question as to why they think you're putting them as a fullback as opposed to a midfielder.
Yes, and depending on the player as well, that's an example. You can also jump in with the character strengths idea. So, for example, saying to them, I want you to use the strength of curiosity when you're out there today to see, what you can do with the ball when you've got, what you can do defensively when a player is trying to attack 1v1.
I love that, because what you're doing there, Lara, is you're providing evidence, aren't you? It's almost the psychology of influence and persuasion. You're providing evidence as to the reasons as to why this player should go back as a fullback, and that evidence isn't just the technical, tactical. It's also the mental. It could be the physical as well. But within the character strengths, you've used the word they're curious. I think that's such a great word. And having a conversation with your players about champions are curious. They're curious as to what better looks like. They're curious about profiling the next level. Bang, right, I can use that word on the pitch. Well, I want you to be curious about being a left back or a right back, a full back. I want you to be curious as to what they see on the pitch. How much better a player are you going to be when you experience that?
Exactly. Yeah, that's just one example of how I sort of see this extra layer of positive psychology research being able to come into this space.
Now, do you have? I'm interested to find out here. So, when you're standing in a classroom and you're speaking with coaches about this, What do you have any objections from coaches? If so, what kind of objections do you tend to hear related around this idea of autonomy supportive versus controlling?
That's I'm just laughing because I don't normally get objections. I work
That's good.
with coaches. I tend to be in their sports club, so they're very comfortable. They're in their own environment. They're sitting around, and I go and give a talk and essentially train them what is in my online program. And I start with motivation. So I start with science from an area called self-determination theory on motivation. Now, when I knew the science was really cool, and I knew it had a lot, it was very relevant to setting up this idea about why you'd even want autonomy, support or control and coaching. But the theory within self-determination theory that looks at this is called organismic integration theory.
Great term, organismic integration theory. Go for it.
And I thought, if I stand up at a sports club and start talk with coaches around that, they're going to kick me out before I've even got the theory word out of my mouth. So I thought, how do I communicate this to coaches? And I developed it around different flavours of motivation. And so because the training starts with looking at motivation and looking at flavours of motivation, I get coaches to actually think also about their own motivation for coaching. And what that then opens up is a discussion where they start to really see where they sit. And I get some amazing questions at that point. And I also get coaches saying, I know this player that is so much the guilt, pride flavour of motivation. He's now dropped out of the club because he was really being sort of only playing because he felt, he was better than everybody else and didn't deal with it when, the level or the challenge got harder, or that sort of thing. And one of the things I really enjoyed, one coach I was working with sent me a video of, it's actually from a ballerina cartoon. And I thought, all the people I'm working with, football coaches, and I'm getting sent this. And it was an absolute gem. It was so spot on. I thought he's really understood what I've been trying to teach him. And then I said, do you mind, I'm going to use this at my teaching at the universities that I work in. So I used that recently at the University of Melbourne. And so I actually find, because of a lot of trial and error, let's just say, of working with coaches, I've worked out how to have a language that gets the motivation discussion going. And then from there, I think it's much easier to win them over, if you like, into why you'd want to be autonomy supportive or why you'd want to be controlling. If anything, I think some of the stuff you've talked about, like, do I have time to do this and those sorts of things. But once I explain the bucket idea, and this isn't about getting rid of any of the other behaviours, it's just about, can you dial up? I talk about dialing up the autonomy supportive behaviours and dialing down the controlling behaviours. It's almost like, if you think about tweaking them, even small tweaks could potentially make, a difference.
What my question did tease out of you is this term self-determination theory. And you've alluded to that this is the theory that underpins autonomy supportive coaching. And you've alluded to flavours of motivation, and I know from my work that motivation isn't unidimensional, it's multidimensional, it's quite complex. And flavours of motivation, can you bring that to life for us? Perhaps that's, what are the vanilla and the chocolate and the strawberry flavours, if you like? And I come from a point of view, let's just say I'm a coach, and I just say to you, yeah, but Lara, it's just they just got to want it, right? You want it or you don't want it. And that's kind of historically perhaps where in the sports community we've been. So if I'm saying that to you, help me understand those flavours a bit.
Okay, so what we do know about the different flavours, you're absolutely right that there's a lot going on in there. And that's why the term flavour is so appropriate, because it's not like we have just one flavour for any activity that we're doing. We've got a mix of them. It's just that we tend to have a predominant flavour, much like a dish that you're eating might have a more predominant flavour. We also know from the research that some of the flavours are what we would call lower motivational quality. And they're more driven by external factors. Things like one of the flavours is, I term it to coaches, the reward or punishment flavour. And that's where you'll get a player that might say something like, I play because my dad gives me money to score goals, or, I play because I'm not allowed to play my video games if I don't, that type of thing. And that's a lower quality form because they're only engaged in the activity because they're kind of having it forced on them. And we know that over time, if that's your predominant flavour of motivation, over time you tend to be less persistent, more likely to burn out and drop out, those sorts of things.
So, sorry to interrupt. So, a working example of that at the elite level could be a striker for a Premier League club who is rewarded financially for scoring 20 goals in the season. Could that kind of be? Yeah. Okay. All right.
So I love that you just raised that example. So we do know, for example, particularly this is over in the US research with male athletes. There's a lot of scholarships available at the universities for male athletes, and we find that they've really enjoyed their sport up until they go off to university, and then they report a lower quality motivation once they start getting their scholarship. So they report less enjoyment of their sport as a result. The amount
of time I spend having conversations around striving to find processes to help players regain the fun and enjoyment they had as a child. Get that back at the elite level is just extraordinary because they stop playing like a child. And when you stop playing like a child, stop playing like a kid, there's a balance to be had. But when you stop that kind of mentality and attitude, your game suffers tremendously.
Absolutely, and I've interviewed for my research other sports psychologists out here in Australia. So Michael Inglis would be an example of one of them, and he talked very much to me about the idea of, he said to a player, your performance has dropped, what's going on for you here? And the player just said, it's not fun anymore. And one of the things they brought back was the humour and the banter. Now, humour is a character strength, so even thinking about, can we bring more humour, appropriate, I'm not saying inappropriate banter, but appropriate humour to make it enjoyable. It costs nothing. It's not a massive tweak. You're still, expecting the players to focus, but you're just creating an environment that's just hopefully more enjoyable for them.
Well, can I just bring that to life again? Sorry, I'm interjecting, but the stuff you're saying is sort of bringing so many examples to my mind. I mean, the England football team this summer. I mean,
I loved watching England this summer.
Wow, this is it, and the atmosphere that clearly the coaching staff. I mean, I know a few people on the inside, and I think that there were, the conversations I've had have ranged from, yes, we did do this, and yes, various things were slightly overblown or taken out of proportion, but what I know for a fact they did do was try to help the players enjoy being out there for a month under the spotlight, pressure on, having fun, and understanding that you can have fun. That it's not only meant to be fun, but actually you optimise your chances of high performance under pressure by having an environment and atmosphere of fun. When you've got to get down to work to play hard, you've got to get down to work and play hard. Now, what it did do, Lara, I think, is that it helped players get closer. I'm not saying they completely optimised their ability and their performance, but it helped players get closer to that. And so, with a bit of fortune and a good win, England got to the semi-finals. They suddenly didn't become the Spain of 2014 or 2012, but they certainly played quite well, and they deserved to get to the semi-finals, in my opinion. So it again, this intrinsic motivation, which you're going to come on and describe, I'm sure, really that flavour really helped the England football team.
I couldn't agree more. And for us here in Australia, it was, we'd be up at midnight till 2 o'clock, and then we'd be going, what do you mean it's going to extra time penalties? And then 2 days we'd have to get up at 4 o'clock. But I was so energised watching the England team because one of the things from, positive psychology perspective that really jumped out at me was just how connected they seemed. I talked earlier about part of flourishing is having positive relationships, and that would be in a sports environment with your teammates. And that just really came through. It came through that everybody seemed to really gel as a team. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed, even though I was exhausted, I think, after a month of watching the World Cup, I don't think I slept much, but it was very enjoyable to just see that all come, exactly what you've described, come together.
Absolutely. So we've got the external motivation, the reward punishment. Yeah. What's the next flavour?
The next flavour, which again is in the lower quality motivation, but slightly more internalised, is guilt and pride flavour. And so a player that plays out of guilt might say something like, I play because I feel I feel guilty about letting my teammates down if I don't turn up. Whereas a player that is playing out of that pride flavour plays because they want to prove that they're better than others. They might be sort of, it's that ego kind of coming into play and the showing off. And in the science, that's called introjected regulation. But with the coaches I work with, I just say that's guilt and pride. And I just wanted to say something on these two, particularly at the lower end of the motivational quality. We describe them a bit like chili. So if you think about chili in a dish, a little bit of chili can give you a bit of a kick to do something that you might not have tried otherwise. So let's just say the coach says, fitness needs to get up. I want you all to go out for a run. And the player's thinking the last thing I want to do is run 5K. But it might be if you don't complete the run, you're starting on the bench. That's a clear punishment sort of thing for not doing, run or whatever. But it might get you out there doing it. And then once you start, you go, I quite enjoy it. And we can think of that with young children when they often play musical instruments because the parents want them to and they didn't want to play it. But once they start to hear that they can make nice sounds and things like that, they go, actually, I do enjoy this now. So even though I'm saying they're lower quality forms of motivation, I don't want to undersell them and say, there's no purpose or no place for those.
And that's the complex dynamic, isn't it? It's understanding that, the external, the reward punishment and the guilt pride, with guilt and pride, but possibly being slightly more intrinsic in terms of its motivational quality. What you're not saying is never have these, never have reward punishment, never have guilt pride. But I love that chili analogy, and I could just imagine at various football clubs where the chili is being sprinkled on the dish, left, right, and centre, and blowing up the mouths of the players are completely on fire, and so they become immobile. It's they can't focus on what they're doing, and it's a great analogy. It's a great analogy.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's yes, particularly when we're teaching it with my students. That's the sort of way that we'd approach these. Is that we're not, we're saying yes, they're not as good quality, but don't expect them not to exist. And as you know, in a professional environment, there's no way that we can say that you can eliminate extrinsic rewards. But again, it's about trying to perhaps soften that chili flavour a bit so that we can let the more internal types of motivation bubble up, if you like. So another flavour which again is starting again to become more internalised is the value flavour. And that's where a player might say, I play because it's important to me. I value being active and learning new skills. We also have the identity one, which again gets slightly more internalised, which is I play because it feels like me, it's part of my identity. So that's when you get the young, player that says, I'm a footballer. They're not, I'm somebody who plays football. It's like, I'm a footballer. And then so they're the four types of extrinsic motivation. So the reward punishment flavour, the guilt pride flavour, the value flavour, and the identity flavour. Okay. And then the fully intrinsic motivation, I describe that as enjoyment and interest flavour. And that is where a player would say, I play because I enjoy it so much. And that's the the young player that you might see is down the park. As soon as school finishes, they're off down the park kicking the ball. Trying to get friends together every lunchtime to have a game because they just can't get enough of playing. Or another example might be they say, I play because the game really interests me. And that might come where curiosity comes in. How far can I develop in this?
And I think I'm going to come back to this notion of putting psychosocial first, and I'm thinking if I was to brainstorm age groups here, and between 6 and 10 years old, 6 and 11 years old, I mean that's where that enjoyment is so important. We're playing, the children are enjoying moving and running and expressing themselves and just kicking. If it's football, they're kicking a ball around. If it's tennis, they're enjoying the ball coming off the racket, and if it's golf, they're just having loads of fun, trying to hit that small ball off the planet. And that's I think at that age level, that intrinsic is so important. As players get older and as coaches start to redefine what they do, or define what they do as a bit more outcome oriented, it's been like, well, I'm trying to help these players develop skill, and I'm trying to help them improve, and as they get 14, 15, 16, 17 and winning, losing, outcome measures start to become more of a thing, then those external motivations can come in, and it's trying to design activities and create an environment, a coaching culture that retains that enjoyment. That when young players are aged between 12 and 16, and there's a lot of coaching is based around skill acquisition, which arguably it should be. Then the challenge for the coach is to retain enjoyment. Peak interest in amongst developing skill, and when that development of skill becomes too controlling and too much of a burden, and the enjoyment is lost, that's when I think coaches are stepping away from being a psychosocial coach and being too much oriented towards the tactical side of things.
Yes.
And it really is at the very elite level as well. The biggest challenge at the elite level, I always say, again, I'm going to use obvious coaches like Jurgen Klopp and Pep Guardiola. They are still invested in participation. So what they do, they still have to tap into intrinsic motivation, player enjoyment, player interest. Where maybe, I know Pep Guardiola is such an obvious person to bring up right now because he's the man of the moment, and whether he will be in a few years' time, I'm sure he will be, but obviously the success he's having and has had. But he has this wonderful balance between having this deep knowledge and delivering on this deep knowledge, but also doing it in a manner that engages players, that absorbs players, that gets players interested in what they're doing and taps their curiosity. So I really think the very best coaches are the ones who, at the elite level, they're still interested in participation, and they're still invested in those intrinsic motivation values of enjoyment and interest.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that where you see, for example, mental health issues with elite athletes is because they've lost touch with the reason they were originally enjoying or interested. It's not always, obviously it's more complex than just that, but that can often be part of that picture.
Well, it's the must, isn't it? It's I've got to perform. We're so socialised at the elite level, and I want to reiterate, I'm talking about the elite level here. So socialised into, I've got to perform, I've got to perform, I've got to perform, we've got to win, we've got to win, we've got to win. And actually, a more adaptive way of seeing performance is, well, I want to win. And that means I want to perform at my best, but I understand that I'm a human being and I might not. So it's actually exploring creative ways, and often revolving around mindset, creative ways of how do I strive to perform at my best, but also how do I get the best from my performance. If I walk onto the pitch or the court or the course and I'm really not at my very best, that's okay, that's fine. But if I have the mental skill to get the best from my performance, if I can turn a 5 out of 10 into a 6 out of 10, then that's acceptable. That's okay. That's cool. That's fine. But I think at the elite level, we're so socialised into must. We've got to perform. That, as you say, mental health challenges can be as a consequence of that very toxic, very claustrophobic performance environment.
Yes, absolutely. It's a tough one because you go, even if you said a view in, for example, in player development space, so I would argue that a focus should really be on the process or like mastery approach type roles, that sort of thing. Because yes, the winning matters, but that doesn't mean you put the emphasis on the winning. Put the emphasis on what's my job and what is it I'm out there to do today. Because the winning will come, if you're getting those things right. So that's much more about the task focus. But of course, I guess, at the professional level, and you'd be more first to answer this question than I would, but at the professional level, it's all very well saying, well, I'm focusing on the task, but then the reality is you get punished with no game time at the end of the following week, for example. Mistakes are punished quite harshly, and they often are punished harshly in youth sport, but I don't think they should be.
Yeah, and I think at the elite level, it's and really this is at the elite level really is the same in terms of what for me it's the same in terms of how an athlete, a competitor should approach their sport at 24 years old if you're making £5 million a year as compared to 16 years old. You've mentioned certain terms: mastery, process, task. You know what, Lara, it's no different, and it shouldn't be different. A 25-year-old who's making a lot of money should be focused, whether they're in the team or out of the team, focused on striving to be the best that they can be. I think they need an environment that accepts vulnerability, that they're human beings. It doesn't matter how much skill they've got in their feet or their hands. The reality is they have brains, they have nervous systems, they're subject to the dysfunctions that their biology can deliver, that tough environments can deliver. So you need a forgiving culture, a forgiving environment, and that doesn't mean that you can't high perform. It actually improves the chances of high performing. An elite player in any sport who is immersed in an environment that promotes mastery and task and process and mindset and psychosocial will consistently high perform under pressure. They really, really will, and it's exactly the same. And you've mentioned the word mastery, and I think this is a really, really interesting conversation to have to finish off this interview. Where do you sit as somebody who's working with sports coaches and somebody who's working with sports psychologists and talking to them, educating them around this notion of positive psychology, but what I know, again, and I'm talking not just elite level, but 16 years and up, and I'm talking at players who have ambition, coaches who have ambition for their players. Maybe the reality is they are in an elite environment. What mastery requires, arguably, is, and I don't think it's actually arguably, I think it's a truism, is players who are able to come out of their comfort zone. I've heard it described as the zone of ugly. It's visiting that zone of uncomfortable during practice and training sessions, because to be outstanding, to be excellent at what you do, you need really high skill. And the argument is that the only way, or the most pragmatic way, to develop high skill is it's not always fun and it's not always comfortable, and there may be an element, the uncomfortable can be enjoyable, it can be enjoyable, but it's not always enjoyable. So I mean, perhaps you've answered it with your buckets, but where do you stand on that Anders Ericsson's deliberate practice? It's not fun to be the best in the world. It's not always fun. It's not always enjoyable. So where do you stand on that, Lara?
Well, I don't just define well-being. So my interest, like I said, my research is looking at flourishing in sport, adolescents flourishing in sport. And, I mentioned earlier, part of our well-being picture is accomplishment, for example, and perseverance. So our well-being isn't just defined by enjoyment, which would be a positive emotion. And that's important. But intrinsic motivation can be things like just, being interested and curious about your environment, which I think very much do sit with things like mastery goals. So an example with the mastery goal, we know if we look at something like flow, Csikszentmihalyi's research, it looks at skill challenge balance. And we do know that for athletes to experience flow, which is a type of enjoyment, they need their skill to be in a sort of a comfortable zone with, I won't say comfort, just push the comfort level. so that they're pushing themselves and learning. Now, in that space, they're going to be making mistakes, and they have to be comfortable with the idea of making mistakes because they are pushing themselves outside of their comfort zone. But we know if you push yourself too far out of your comfort zone, that you can experience anxiety and worry and everything that goes with that. And also, if your skill, the challenge is too low for your skill, you're more likely to experience boredom and apathy and just not be into the activity. So the idea around being able to push yourself is, I guess it can be referred to the sweet spot or things like that, is to push just enough beyond, so have a challenge that's just high enough beyond your skill level to extend you. And in self-determination theory, competence is one aspect of our well-being. In positive psychology, it's this idea of flow, and ideas of accomplishment are also part of our well-being. So it still makes up that whole picture. But I would say that can still be intrinsic if you're bringing in that curiosity about what can I do here, or part of it might be trying to be creative on the field, and allowing yourself to be creative, because actually you're going to make mistakes when you're trying new tricks or things as well.
I like what you said there, because you've kind of brought the answer into your framework, into the strength-based framework, into positive psychology framework, in as much as seeking out excellence is being curious. Seeking out excellence is discipline, it's determination, it's flow, it's stretch. And what I hear you say is, look, that those terms aren't divorced from positive psychology. They're part of strength-based character, personality. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah. So in other words, the mastery in that struggle can actually be part of our well-being, because as long as we're comfortable with the discomfort, if you like, of failing, of making mistakes in front of other people and that sort of thing, that can be quite adaptive. So mastery approach goals, for example, are linked to task interest and satisfaction, which very much aligns with intrinsic motivation. They're linked with task absorption and and general competence. Some of the more ego-focused goals, in particular, can be linked, like especially ego avoidance goals, can be linked to that guilt, pride flavour of motivation. So it does kind of link in, if you like.
Well, that's brilliant, and that's I've certainly been absorbed by this interview. So I was demonstrating, hopefully a character trait I do demonstrate a lot of the time, and I'm sure the audience were absorbed, and I've got no doubt they'll be motivated to get in contact. See what I'm doing here? See, I'm tying it all together, Lara. I'm tying it all together. If they are motivated to get in touch, which I've got no doubts they will be, how can people find you?
If they've got a Twitter account, I'm at Lara Mossman, all one word. Used no creativity in coming up with my Twitter handle, I have to say. So they can find me on there. And my website is www.laramossman.com.au. So they can also contact me through the website.
Brilliant. Excellent. Lara, thank you so much for joining me. Everybody, that was Lara Mossman. Wasn't that superb? I took so much away from that that I'm certainly going to read up more about and go back and use for my consultancy, and hopefully you took some gems from that. If you did enjoy it, please do leave a review, and remember you can subscribe to the podcast to listen to future editions of the show. I've got some fantastic guests coming up in the next few weeks, so please do tune in again. I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.